Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We have been talking quite a bit about the Jewish value of pikuach nefesh as we work our way and muddle our way through this pandemic. Pikuach nefesh means the preservation of life, and it is one of the most basic of Jewish values. Where does it come from? Well, one of the origins in the Torah happens to be in this week's Torah portion, Acharei Mot, which addresses many prohibitions on behavior, particularly sexual behavior. And that is what draws most people's attention to this chapter. And in fact, it is read in many congregations on the High Holy Days. However, at the beginning of chapter 18 in the book of Leviticus, we read a very interesting phrase as part of the introduction to many of these specific laws. And the Israelites are being instructed not to follow the ways of the Egyptians. That's the introduction to all of these. And it is followed by a particular verse that says, and again, this is Leviticus 18. And it is verse 5, Ushmartem et chukotai et ve'et mishpotai asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem ani Adonai. Our translation in our Chumash Eitz Chaim, which we use most often at Temple Israel, says, You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. I am Adonai. So the key phrase here is v'chai bahem, that you shall live by them, in them. Bahem is subject to a little bit of ambiguity because the be in the beginning is a prefix and it means in, but it can also mean by or with. And our translation in Eitz Chaim says, in the pursuit of which you shall live. So what does it mean to live by them? This is a phrase and an idea that will be repeated in Deuteronomy in chapter 30. And when we get to Deuteronomy, we can revisit that. But in Deuteronomy, we are told to choose life, And pikuach nefesh is the exemplary phrase that says the preservation of life can override all mitzvot. And it is explored not just in Torah commentaries, but also in the Talmud and in all kinds of commentaries ever since. What does it mean to live by them? What does it mean to choose life? And there are many commentaries, as I said. The basic notion is that any and all commandments can be overridden in order to preserve a life, with the exception of incest or idolatry or denying God. And most of the time, or at least much of the time, you will see that the commentaries on trying to unpack this idea focus on Shabbat because of the many, many ways that we seek not to work on Shabbat. Things that are forbidden, things that we can and should do before Shabbat begins so that we don't have to do them on Shabbat itself, so that we can devote Shabbat to ourselves, our relationships, and especially our relationship with God. But if someone is ill, then all of those mitzvot, all of those halachot, the Jewish law, the Jewish guidelines for our behavior and for our implementing the mitzvot from the Torah into our daily lives, should be set aside in the case of illness. It's a hard concept for many Jews, particularly those who are most stringent about ritual observance, but they get it. We talk about it on Yom Kippur, particularly in relation to fasting. If your health might be at risk by fasting, if you are taking medications that require food, you cannot skip them on Yom Kippur. On Shabbat, we are prohibited from making fire. We're prohibited from traveling more than a very short distance. All the many things that would have to do with arranging to care for a sick person. Another special case in the Mishnah is when we talk about what a doctor may or may not do. Doctors in particular are not bound by the limits on travel on Shabbat in order to care for a sick person. If a woman is in labor or has just given birth, make a fire, keep her comfortable, take care of whatever she needs, whatever she wants. So this idea of pikuach nefesh becomes a particularly key exception and a core Jewish value, because we are created in God's own image, after all. We must take care. One of the better known examples, I think, which has bearing on our particular situation today, comes from the middle of the 19th century. Rabbi Israel Salanter, who was a young rabbi in Vilna at the time. In the 1840s, there was a cholera epidemic in the area, and it particularly struck in Vilna in 1848. And Rabbi Salanter determined and published an opinion that said you must not fast on Yom Kippur because you need to keep up your strength in order to resist the illness. And he was very radical in this. He was condemned by his colleagues, by his peers, because he sat outside the synagogue and ate on Yom Kippur morning and fed the congregants as well. But he maintained that one should follow the advice of the physicians, that one should isolate, separate, clean, wash, and obey whatever orders the doctors give. So at one point, even, there was a suspicion of fish being a source of disease. And so Rabbi Salanter said that anyone who ate fish might as well be eating pork. You cannot put your life in danger. So here is something that he wrote that I think is also applicable to us today. And I think it is helpful to know what our tradition has said, but also what our rabbis in communities struck by illness have advised, have told their congregants, their communities regarding maintaining health. It's not a new situation for humanity in general. We've had plagues before, but we haven't had one quite like this one in a very, very long time. So Rabbi Salanter wrote, "Now that this disease is abroad in the land, and heaven deliver us here also. This is the teaching for man and the way of common sense. Not to fear it at all, for what is man's life in all its aspects? For who knows if one's path is proper? One must also heed the instructions of the physicians, in light of whose words we shall walk, even by the law, that is the Torah, and to establish the life of this world for good and for betterment. For experience has taught us that in days past, when the disease spread greatly, whoever took upon himself the burden of the doctor's orders in his diet and so forth was free of the signs of the disease. May heaven protect us. And it is also the case today, while we see reported in the news media that many ultra Orthodox communities, Haredi communities, have suffered far more than other Jewish communities because they live in such close quarters. And the media are very quick to report this and to report times when um, those in those communities, including their leaders, have decided to ignore the advice of physicians, to gather, to study, to celebrate, and to mourn. And yet, those are the exceptions. Even in the ultra Orthodox communities, people are taking great care, wearing masks, washing hands, not touching their faces. Most Jews across all the spectrums understand that pikuach nefesh is key to our survival as a people, as a community, whether it is spiritual survival or physical survival. And while in many times our commentators on this particular verse in Leviticus have wanted to explain to us that it refers to spiritual survival and often more to eternal life in the world to come than in this world. We have also great commentators, esteemed commentators such as Nachmanides and Maimonides, who tell us that this really is about our lives in this world, that we are, in fact, bound to do everything we can to preserve life, to keep ourselves safe. If we obey the statutes and laws, if we obey the mitzvot, the halacha that we are guided by, whether it is Orthodox halacha or reform and progressive, and remember that the word halacha literally means a way. It does not literally mean law, although for some Jews it is understood that way. But it is guidance, how to turn the Torah into a living guidebook for strong, healthy, moral, compassionate lives for each of us, but also for our communities. If we obey God's statutes, if we keep to God's values, then we shall indeed live by them. Shabbat Shalom.